Well, Russia appears to be making an all-out push for battlefield gains ahead of Vladimir Putin's meeting with Donald Trump. In its initial invasion, Russia seized a large chunk of Ukraine's territory, approximately 120,000 square kilometers. But by the end of the year, Ukraine had beaten Russian forces back, regaining more than half the land it had lost. The war then settled into a slow grind, with Russian forces advancing at great human cost. Moscow has seen its biggest gains in a year this week, but it has still only taken about 1% of Ukraine's landmass over the past year. European leaders say that one possible option to at least temporarily bring an end to the conflict in Ukraine is to freeze it. Active fighting between Russia and Ukraine would stop immediately, while negotiations on reaching a more lasting peace would continue. Let's take a look at what a frozen conflict could mean for Ukraine.
From a hot war to a frozen conflict. That's one way a ceasefire might work. There's no universal definition of a frozen conflict, but it often refers to when hostilities end without a peace treaty. Battle lines would stay where they are now, with Russia holding on to the territory it's taken. Ukraine would be spared further onslaughts, and both countries could, in theory, start talks aimed at a permanent peace deal. In theory, a freeze would not require international recognition of the land that Russia has taken by force as official Russian territory. But Ukraine fears that Russia would just use a freeze to buy time to build up its military for another invasion. For Russia, a freeze would leave parts of 4 regions that it claims as its own in Ukrainian hands. It's unclear what concessions Russia would require to stop its frontline attacks, and a freeze might not last. Russian President Vladimir Putin has consistently said that any deal must address the root causes of the conflict. That list includes regime change in Ukraine, shrinking Ukraine's military, and renouncing NATO membership, none of which have so far been acceptable to Ukraine.
Well, there's been no let-up in fighting between Russia and Ukraine ahead of the summit. Kyiv has confirmed that it struck an oil refinery in the Russian city of Syzran early this morning. It also hit a Russian port and cargo vessel used to transport military supplies on Thursday. The Ukrainian military has been targeting key infrastructure, often with drones deep inside Russia. Russia's offensive, meanwhile, has continued unabated, and reports say Russian forces are making important gains on the front line in the eastern Donetsk region. Ukrainian officials in several regions have also reported casualties from strikes over the past 24 hours. Let's bring in Marina Miron here. She's a military analyst at the Defense Studies Department at King's College London. Marina, Russia is making advances in eastern Ukraine in the run-up to the Alaska talks. Does that make it less likely that Vladimir Putin will agree to a ceasefire?
Good afternoon, Terry. We don't know what Vladimir Putin will agree to, essentially, because we don't know the layout of the talks. And I think the U.S. president has been very cautious as not to set a very clear agenda when it comes to what is going to be discussed. Certainly, Ukraine is going to be one of the talking points, and how the future might look like in terms of a potential ceasefire or a potential peace agreement. That being said, of course, such a breakthrough right before the talks puts Russia into a better position, because usually before such high-level talks, both sides would try to demonstrate their capabilities on the battlefield. And so for the Russian forces, which have been on the offensive for quite a while now, it is an important breakthrough, and it demonstrates the persisting problems within the Ukrainian armed forces. And Ukrainian commentators, military commentators, also agree with the fact that it demonstrates the lack of Ukrainian manpower and complicates the situation for the Ukrainian troops in Pokrovsk.
Could Russia's battlefield advances increase the pressure on Ukraine, Marina, to accept a bad deal?
Well, I think what the Russians will try to do is increase the pressure on the U.S. rather than on the Ukraine. So these preliminary talks will most likely include that specific point, as I said before. And Ukraine doesn't really have a lot of options here if we look logically. If Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin don't agree on something, the only other alternative is to keep fighting for Ukraine, but without US support. And Europe and the UK, the coalition of the willing, has shown willingness to help, but materially it cannot sustain helping Ukraine in the rate that Ukraine requires. And certainly the coalition is not willing to send boots on the ground, despite the fact that today UK's defense minister promised to send UK boots on the ground if a ceasefire agreement is reached. But that would be only in case of a ceasefire. So for Ukraine, either way, the situation is very complicated, and it might be cornered into accepting something that is not beneficial, specifically because it is losing on the battlefield.
These talks are between the U.S. and Russian presidents right now. You call them preliminary. Trump himself says he's there to listen. Assuming a ceasefire is what President Trump is wanting in this situation, what leverage, Marina, does he have to get Russia to agree to one?
Well, it is an interesting one because in terms of leverage, the United States, we do recall brokering the peace deal between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And I think it is an important step. So the leverage would be not necessarily Ukraine or not necessarily another package of sanctions against China or so. It will be more about possibly expanding or curtailing Russian influence in the Caucasus. And while the war in Ukraine is happening on the geopolitical front, Russia has lost Syria, so it has a complicated situation in the Middle East and now in the Caucasus with Turkey rising. So Trump could play to those geopolitical configurations which do not favor Russia in order to exert some pressure.
Marina, thank you very much. That was military analyst Marina Miron.
Thank you for having me.